Hi, my name's Woodward. My artwork Planet is currently touring in the Experimenta Life Forms exhibition. So I make kinetic sculptures, so sculptures that move generally. I also do some animation and drawing as well, but my main practice is kinetic work. I studied sculpture at university and actually started making kinetic work at one point when I had a sculpture and I was trying to resolve it, and it became clear that what it needed was to actually move, and that was my first kinetic work. I then have developed that practice over many years now, and generally the sort of process that I use to make my work, I start off in my sketchbook, just like nutting out ideas. Often artworks will kind of evolve from a problem in a previous artwork, because there's always issues when you're trying to make machines. And so the work will kind of develop through some of that problem solving kind of thing, and also in the context of the exhibition it might be for, or the space it might be for. I then do quite a lot of like hands-on testing of things with really rough kind of prototypes in my studio. For example, to figure out how much leverage something might need, I'll tend to just test that out instead of kind of calculate it and that sort of thing. Often just made with sort of plywood or like bits of scrap material that I've got around. And then from there I start to then resolve the work. I work in Rhino 3D quite a bit to sketch it out, mainly in 2 dimensions, just to get the sort of details of parts sorted out. And then I'll have pieces either CNC cut on our in-house router where we can do plastics and aluminium, or I send them off for laser cutting. And I then just keep working on them. Often I build things, discover what's not working in them, have to pull them apart again and refine them until they're sort of ready for exhibition. Quite a few of my parts we can actually make downstairs. My husband and I own a fabrication business called light-refactor that mainly does furniture, but it does mean that we have some really great equipment to use. And we actually initially started light-refactor. We bought our first piece of equipment because I was trying to make a sculpture, so the two are like really tightly tied together in that regard. And so yeah, it's really great to have that kind of cross-pollination of the different processes, but also having access to that equipment has been really fundamental to my practice. So I actually use water as a key material in many of my kinetic works. That started off, the very first kinetic sculpture I made, I ended up using water because I couldn't afford the motor that was powerful enough to lift the sculpture in the way that I needed. And I figured out that if I used a little fountain pump and filled up a bucket with water, that weight would achieve that. And that's kind of where it started, and that's the main reason that I used water for many years in my practice. But as my aesthetic decisions started to get towards kind of where they are now, and I started to use a lot of clear plastics to hold the water, I really noticed in the gallery that there was some really interesting light play happening with the relationship between the plastic and the forms of the plastics and the water and the various gallery lights, particularly halogen lights, would do really crazy refractive things. And so a few years ago I started more actively developing works that really played with the relationship between the light and the water, and that's where the work Planet evolved from, was in that series of experiments with how to kind of focus the work a bit more in on the light itself, and what happens when you pair up light with water and make the water move, essentially, which was one of the big drivers of the Planet work. So in terms of what's going on with my piece Planet, there's the core of the work is a acrylic sphere which is holding water, clear water, and mounted above that is a really powerful LED spotlight. And so that goes through the water, and the water acts like a lens and actually refracts the light. And so it casts some really kind of beautiful patterns onto the floor, and also kind of refracts up through the other sides of the sphere and casts light around as well. Sometimes you get rainbow effects in it depending on the other things going on in the gallery. So essentially the water is acting as a lens for the light to kind of behave in this interesting way through it. And there's a little pump running air bubbles through it, so that actually changes the patterning as well because the water's not static. So initially the kind of the formation of that work came through these experiments with light and water in a really kind of pragmatic way, but as I then started to develop the work further for Experimenta Life Forms, I really was aware of how it kind of, the work was sort of embodying the like fundamental building blocks of life being light, air and water, and so it just, I decided to keep it really simple for that reason, because it really just did hone in on those qualities and really draw attention to how those elements interact, and obviously in an abstract way. It's not like it's in a huge ecosystem or anything, but it just brings attention down to those really simple building blocks. So in terms of the sort of relationship between all the materials, what I'm particularly interested in making kinetic work, and I think what has kept this going for me for such a long time in my practice, is that when you bring certain things together, and in this case often it's plastics and water or metals and water, and the weight of water and those kinds of things, that certain behaviours emerge in the work that they're somewhat separate from what I've tried to instigate in the work. So often the work kind of takes on a quality of its own that is that I think of as behaviours. Other people might think of them as like liveliness or things like that. That's kind of a challenging proposition, and you could go into that in great depth. But they've definitely got things that they do and don't do that are very much from the work rather than from me trying to make that specific thing happen. I'm obviously very involved in it, but the work emerges through what happens between the materials and things like gravity and those kind of things, and also what happens from my input with it as well. And that's where the work actually comes from, rather than it coming just from me and being kind of top down. I've been becoming sort of increasingly aware of my use of materials in my practice, particularly with plastics. With the metals that I use, stainless steel and aluminium, they're both very recyclable. Aluminium obviously has a lot more embodied energy in it than steel and stainless steel, but at least at the end of life and with offcuts and that material can be almost 100% recycled. Plastics is a whole other matter at the moment, particularly in terms of the recycling streams that exist in Australia. I don't kind of actively have a way of managing that at the moment, except that I just hold on to all my offcuts so that down the track in 10 or 20 or 30 years time, when those really good recycling streams exist, then I might actually be able to properly recycle them. I recently put in a grant application for some research funding to be able to find out some ways of working better with plastics. So whether that's using different processing techniques that have less wastage, or also looking at bioplastic options or materials that might behave like plastics and potentially look like plastics from an aesthetic point of view, but that actually exist in the world not as a plastic per se. So those are some of the ways that I'm trying to kind of improve the eco footprint of my practice, and also trying to make things that hopefully might exist in the world for a long time, rather than being artworks that are shown once and then kind of discarded.